Hello and welcome back to the YouTube studio here at the Berlin Global Dialogue. I'm Jack Kelly and we've got a really exciting conversation ahead about Europe and about investment and kind of opportunities that sit ahead for the continent. And I wanted to start just kind of very openly. There's a lot of transition, there's a lot of change in Europe at the moment, but I'm curious what you see as the biggest investment opportunities and the biggest change opportunities for Europe at the moment.
Jack, thank you very much for having me. First of all, I applaud what you have built.
Thank you.
A large subscriber base, and it's so important that we have some new media entrepreneurs who do that. And so congratulations and thank you for spending the time with me.
Absolutely.
In terms of where the investment opportunities lie in Europe, at KKR we see three.
Okay.
There's three main trends. The first is clearly that in an aging continent, you know, Elon Musk talks about this as his main preoccupation, that the Western world has a real population growth issue. That means plenty of investment opportunities, for instance, in healthcare, but also in education to retool people's skills. And so that's a big one. The second one is we talk a lot about digital infrastructure. Digitization and technology is something that Europe is catching up on. We clearly are in a world where China and America are very much ahead with global platforms, but that's a significant investment opportunity for us here in Europe. And then thirdly, you touched upon it, we are in the midst of a massive transition in terms of how our economy is producing, from one that's based on fossil fuels to one that's more energy efficient. We are more impacted, you know, than others are because of the Ukraine war. So clearly that's a significant investment opportunity as well for us to help with that transition.
On digitization specifically, you mentioned obviously that countries like China and America have a head start on Europe. Are there specific areas of digitization you think that Europe should be capitalizing on more? Are there opportunities that are being left by the big players?
Well, so we can have a very lengthy conversation about AI.
Yes.
That's going to change the world. It is probably too optimistic to assume that Europe can play a role in it. You remember that DeepMind, which is now tooling up Google's AI effort, was a UK company. So there's a lot of interesting AI, you know, developments in the UK. I think they can play a role, but it's probably more on the application layer than on the fundamental infrastructure layer, which will be built most likely in the US and in China.
And private capital is obviously very important to a lot of this, especially when we're looking at kind of transitional issues, things like the energy transition, kind of transitioning kind of all of the world towards more green and sustainable future. What role do you think that private capital plays in those kind of transitions and assisting countries around the world?
So that's a great question. If you think about the private equity industry, it was founded almost 50 years ago by Henry Kravis and George Roberts, my founders. At that time, I mean, Henry Kravis talks about this, you know, it was enough to put capital in a company and then, you know, restructure it a little bit financially and then make a good return. You can't do that anymore. Today, our job is that of an entrepreneurial capital provider, meaning you invest, but really what people are looking for is your active help in changing the underlying company. In Europe, that means from day one, we are in small countries here. So people look for help to go beyond borders. A few years back, it used to be Asia, from morning to night. You know, we are the largest private equity firm in Asia, so people were asking us, how do we get to Japan? How do we get to China? How do we get to Korea? That has pivoted a bit since the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. The US has very much now taken center stage. And people really want help to increase their investment blueprint in America now. So going beyond borders, but also retooling companies. We talk about technology. You know, we have a large blueprint in Silicon Valley, and European companies are looking for help with how do I actually implement technology in my companies.
So obviously, specifically more on the green transition, it's a big opportunity for Europe and for businesses in Europe. And it's also obviously a major existential threat kind of globally. So how optimistic and pessimistic would you say you are about the green transition, the success of that transition on kind of both levels?
So it's interesting because it's a tale really of three phases. You think about COVID, you know, the EU, the way to get us through COVID and to get people through COVID was very different from, for instance, the American way. The American way was to send financial support directly to households. The EU came up with that next generation EU program, which meant there was a €1 trillion, collateralized program for companies that wanted to go and green up their supply chains, etc., in the economy. There was help. So there was a very early realization that this isn't a priority. So that was very positive. Then we had a war in Ukraine, which is a terrible tragedy, but it created a sense of urgency and a necessity for the transition, which was very much different from what we originally thought when we came out of COVID. Overnight, you had to replace more than half of Germany's electricity, generation supply. So that was massive. And so we have been in a permanent crisis state. We still are in this war, so we cannot say that we are through the crisis, but we're coming certainly in the third phase now, which is a steady as it go phase, where it creates tremendous opportunity in Europe. You see, as KKR, we have invested 10 billion plus in the UK, for instance, in renewables, in waste to energy transition. And there's just a lot of capital. It's a very capital intensive transition that opens for private capital the opportunity to do private public partnerships. Yeah. And overall, we have been through these transitions before. After the war, the way that our economies had to work had to be radically transformed. So overall, it's a tough transition because we had that shock therapy of the war. Yeah. But overall, it will create opportunity and value, and it will bring people into innovative new jobs over time.
And you talk about that kind of public-private partnership. Do you think that enough is being done there to utilize that kind of framework, or is there more that could be done to take advantage of private capital?
Well, I mean, the IRA was a watershed moment where the US leapfrogged Europe that had a lead with the Next Generation EU program. Yeah. You see plenty of activity in the US now. And the EU is doing good work, the UK is doing good work, but certainly more can be done.
Absolutely. Finally, a moment ago on the main stage, Chancellor Scholz talked about the importance of political consent when it comes to the green transition and transitioning more generally. How do you think we guarantee that the benefits of the green transition, digitalization, are spread evenly around the world in order to avoid blowback politically?
That's a very important question, because I just pointed out that we will create tremendous value to a lot of this innovation. But of course, we also talked about the fact that we have large global platforms which reap a lot of that value. I think there's two ways that value can be spread and that everybody can be taken on the journey. The first is broad-based ownership. We at KKR have very much embraced that. So if you look, for instance, of some of our most recent investments, we make sure that every single employee that works at these companies is participating in the equity of those companies. So when we transition that company from A to B, from old to new, the value that is created is broadly spread. So more generally speaking, we got to find a way to spread the wealth more broadly for people to be taken on the journey. The second way, to answer your question, how we can make sure it's broad-based, is education, because we will face disruption by AI, by the green energy transition and other trends through the character of jobs. And to make sure that people are, able to have good, high-paying jobs in the future, education is a critical element. So with that, I think there's a bright future ahead.
Fantastic. Encouraging to hear that there's some optimism there.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time.
Of course.